Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees. I'm John. I'm here with Rose. Say hi, Rose.
Hi, everybody.
And I'm here with Jacob.
What's up, everyone?
He's been loved, he's been missed, but he's back in action. And we have a special guest with us today, the Right Reverend Daniel Southwick. Daniel's coming to us all the way from California. So why don't you go ahead and say hello, Dan, introduce yourself to the folks.
Hey guys, my name is Dan, and I am a pastor in Southern California. Like John said, I'm one of the pastors at Palmdale Church. You can check us out at palmdale.church. I know that's pretty cool.
It's very hard to remember.
And then, yeah, I know, but we try to make it difficult. So my background, I have a degree in historical theology. And John and I both share an affinity for the ancient Near East literature and archaeology. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me to hang out in your trees.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I see what he did there, Rose. He worked in our
He's
title.
sitting under our branches. This is so terrible.
That got weird.
That was
We're going to stop that immediately. No, but what we kind of wanted to do is last week we had a great opportunity to talk to Dr. Osborne. And when we got off the air, I almost talked him into going on our salmon fishing trip. Like it was this close. Like it would have totally changed. Changed the trip entirely. But it would have been fun. So, Dr. Osborne, if you're out there, reconsider. We are friends. You can hang out with us. We're fun. But he did go over a ton of really great information with us about the way that the Bible utilizes tree imagery, and especially how it was important in the ancient Near Eastern context. And so I contacted Daniel. Daniel's been on our Facebook page from about the time that people started listening to our podcast. And so I knew he had a lot of thoughts and things to mention about that. And so, Dan, what came to your mind as you were listening to the episode? Like, what parts of it stuck out, and where did it make you go in your studies? Describe what happened.
Yeah, so, I've been familiar with Dr. Osborne's work. I hadn't actually read the book, so I got to dig into it a little bit this week. But yeah, the idea of the imagery of trees and kings and how that flows from the divine is super interesting. And for me, it brought my mind back to some of the ancient Near East stories, especially from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Recently, I've been going through the book of Jonah. So I'm doing a deep dive in the book of Jonah. So I've been doing a lot of study on Phoenicians and their gods and the Baals and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, it brought me to thinking about this story that I just recently ran into about the descent of Inanna, who is actually the Sumerian version of Ishtar, and how in that story, she's also described as a tree. And so that kind of propelled me into digging in really deep this week and just trying to see what correlations that I could make that we could kind of play off this week.
Yeah, I love when you're reading through stuff and then you notice, like, okay, this doesn't just apply to the Bible. This applies to this whole time period. That this isn't something like the Bible is happening in its own little set world and the rest of human history is just going on in a completely different direction. That what God gave to us is wonderfully connected to everything else that's happening in the ancient world. And there are things that we can learn from the world around Israel that help us see what God is talking about. And looking at the stories of the pagan gods like Baal or Inanna and those things, obviously we recognize that those are lies, those are demonic propaganda. But the way that they talk about themselves is the way that the Bible addresses them as well. It talks about trees being chopped down and the concept of a great leader being like, I think in her story, she's a boxwood. Is that right? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah,
kind of
the fragrant boxwood.
Yeah. Oh, something that smells good. Yeah, something that engages all of the senses. And so I thought that was neat too. Rosa, when you went back and you were thinking about it, and you've been teaching your kids for forever. How does thinking about the biblical concept of trees, how does that engage like your teaching of history or your understanding of the ancient world in general?
It doesn't. I'm not trying to be a two trees downer here, but this is opening it up for me because we just finished a round through the ancient world with our studies. And we're more into like the monasteries and church history and things right now. And if I would have known all this as I was teaching through the ancient world last year, I would have really leaned into it. But I just want to say something that you said. I want to repeat it. I was completely blown away when I started studying world history overlaid with Bible history, kind of like, like if you take a transparency and lay it over it, it's like, what? Look at all this stuff matching up.
Yeah.
Look at these people interacting with these people. They're just Bible names. They're just places until you study those cultures separately. And then when you see them in the Bible, even something like Uriah the Hittite, when the kids studied the Hittite Empire, it was, and then we learned about him, they're like, got it, Uriah the Hittite, And so these things that you learn outside of the Bible and then put it into its place as you start reading through it, it really just opens up that these were real people that lived in real time. And it's just amazing how God has worked those two things in our minds together.
I agree. I think thinking of them as just extras in the biblical story is to misunderstand the complexity of what God is doing. He's put Israel to represent him to the nations of the world. And their religions were real. We dig up their stuff all the time. And so to understand the way that they're talking about these things helps us to engage in the conversation quite a bit. Now, one of the things that I really liked from Dr. Osborne's talk is he talked about the idea of living in the land versus living on it. And he called us a displaced people. And that has really been bothering me ever since the idea. I went to the grocery store the other day, and I can more or less get any fruit I want. Like if it's there, I can get bananas whenever. The ability to grab produce or goods it doesn't really matter to me. Maybe for you out in California, it's a little bit different. You guys seem to really crave rain, but here in Ohio, it rains all the time. And so the idea of looking at the world as a consumer rather than looking at the world as something that I'm a part of really was challenging for me. And then when I dragged that idea into being the church, that the church's job is not to get things from its community. It's not about making people like us or controlling the narrative and forcing people to then join what we're doing. But thinking of the church and God's calling to us to be a blessing, and that wherever we go, we're to be bearing the fruit of the Spirit, the love, the joy, the peace, the long-suffering, and to view church not as something that you attend, but as something that is blessing the community that it's in like a tree was really heavy for me. Jacob, you had some thoughts on that.
No, yeah, I also when he did say that, and I listened to this earlier today, I'm like, I'm gonna. It's one of those like when you write it down and you had to think about it for a little bit. But I remember thinking and reading through the Bible and just thinking like, okay, it's just shrubbery. However, it does give some specifics as it goes through. It does. I mean, it's like
shrubbery.
That's it. Yeah, it's just greenery.
The path.
It's like, but the oaks of Mamre. You notice that there's something specific. There must have been something about that particular tree that everyone, oh yeah, that one. Like, but the imagery, seeing the chopping them down, that kind of stuff, I've seen that too, but I never really flowed this into the entirety of Scripture until we started doing this podcast. And so it's been a beautiful thing. But I love the idea too of living in the land, on the land, or vice versa, of just the difference between the two.
I just feel like so much of church culture is consumerism. It's about putting on a really good show. It's about presenting yourself as the best option for you and your family to come to, and there's just a tremendous stage that feels to be the drive of church culture as I experience it. What's it like out on the West Coast, man? Do you guys naturally tend towards community and blessing one another, or is this part of the culture out there as well?
No, I think that we're talking about a Western context for the Western world, right? We've created an ideal of individualism, and consumerism is just what we do. It's what we're good at. And if, the church, unfortunately, fed into that for years, going back into the 70s into the early 2000s, right? It was really driven on a seeker sensitive church. They wanted to provide everything that we have on the outside, every kind of entertainment to draw people in. But in doing so, I think that we've sacrificed some of the theology that we need to get back to.
I think that, again, our faith is never, one of the things I brought up the other day, it may have been a rambling I was thinking about, is talking about how our faith isn't personal. We've made this idea of like, my walk with Jesus is about me. And I'm like, you've been baptized into a family. You're now part of something far bigger. We're part of a body. You are a part of a body that we function and move together. And so, again, I'm far more relational in my wiring. So this kind of thing isn't hard for me, but I can't help but to think that some of the greatest movements in my own personal life we're seeing is moving in community with other people, not been in isolation.
Yeah. And I don't know that there's no replacement for friendship. Like, you can go to a great church service, and I can preach like the best sermon of my life, and it's not going to have the same impact as people around you who genuinely love you and are interested in you, and that idea of together worshiping is garden-like. It's that image of abundance, that there's enough here,
right?
And this is something to be beautiful, more so than just like, look at our stage design or our lights, or I like the look of this church, or that guy's dressed really trendy, or whatever.
I think God can use a lot of, he can use anything. He uses a sermon, he uses the stuff that happens before service and after service, but I really love to see what God has been doing when you invite someone either over to your home or out to dinner. You share a meal together, you share time together, and if you use it intentionally, it could be really a beautiful space. So, I see this idea of community from what Jesus modeled for how God created, even the idea of Adam and Eve, that relationship, that these two would be more together. Anyway, I just see this community, this togetherness is really kind of the movement of the church, how we should move forward. But the Western culture, we're terrible at that. When I was in Iraq, the guys from Pakistan and Egypt, Nepal, and all these areas, they would make a meal, and they would all sit around and share this meal together, and they would invite us to come and eat with them. And I loved it. And we would not go to chow hall; we would go eat with them. And it seemed like it was just part of how they are, and we don't know, we miss that.
Yeah, and looking at that, like, you may think we're off topic here. I don't think we are. It's to go beyond just the fact of, okay, there is this thing called tree imagery in the Bible. It exists. But then the question becomes, now what? Like, I understand now that there is this thing, that I can read the text and I can file this away as a historical fact. And for me, that's where I want to stop, because I'm really interested in it. I love the reading. I love the engaging in the past. I love the reading the stories and understanding how history was working. But then to take it the way that Jesus does is to then engage in the present as well, and to allow this style of thinking and prophetic imagery to not only be something that was true then, but something that we should be thinking about now. And how do I, as a tree planted by waters, hopefully, how do I become part of what God is doing in my community, in my church, whether you're a pastor or you're just a person in the pews? It really matters. The way that you live your life and the way that you think about your relationship with God and the way you think about your relationship with other people is incredibly personal. That's true, but it's also very communal. If you've ever picked fruit from a tree, it's not accidental. You go up in the tree, like you're looking through the branches. We have right now a garden, and picking fruit out of the garden involves looking. It involves digging through the plant. Your hands come away smelling like the plant that you're digging around in. You don't pick the ones that just fall into your hand, because those ones typically are falling off for a reason. They're past their prime. But the idea is that we've got to be active and engaging in this. And so even though this is a historical fact, it's much more than that. This is the way that God was talking about the people of God impacting the cultures that were around them. And so I kind of see this, we're displaced people, we are. But we're also displaced not just from the land, but we're displaced in time from the way the Bible is talking about things. The community of Israel, the nation of Israel, was surrounded by a community of nations that shared common images, that talked about certain things. And we, as even in studying history, Rose, like we kind of take like ancient Sumer and the Hittites, and that's almost like the appendix. Like, maybe this is like the warm-up stuff to when history really gets going with the Romans. And then we'll start talking. And we kind of treat all this like, well, it doesn't really matter. And so many people are really shocked to find out that the Bible is using the language of that ancient world.
No, I was thinking how I think it's Galatians. Sorry, it feels a little late tonight, guys. I think it's in Galatians. It says that in the fullness of time, God sent his son. And there's so many things in that to me when we go through history. It's like, why did he send his son in that time? I know there's a cosmic reason and there's an eternal reason, but also the world that he was born into was the perfect time to do it. And we can see this by reading our Bibles, but like you said, the cultures around them, they weren't just extras, as you put it. It's not like a stage setting and then all these people are moving around. I really like that idea. Also, I don't want to rabbit trail here, but have you guys ever read books or?
I've read books.
Okay, yeah, we
like
know,
at
John.
least one.
You're like a straight up nerd. But the thing is there's these books about trees and how they talk to each other.
The Giving Tree?
Yeah.
No, I was
Shel
thinking the same
Silverstein?
thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've read that because I know.
Well, no, I'm not this that, but I was thinking about how like the communication of trees. I think that the redwoods, the root system, they share together. There's
trees
communication
actually,
between trees.
I think a lot of
different
trees
types of
do.
trees will send resources to each other through their root systems. There are even times
So we're
where
not talking about Fangorn Forest.
we're not talking about what?
We're not talking about Fangorn Forest then.
Oh, yes,
Oh,
some Ents walking
yeah,
around.
awesome.
That's
Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah, I would
Oh.
talk about that.
I think I would too. A little tree beard.
Yes.
Isengard is
did
going
you finish
down.
what you were going to say?
Sorry. Yes.
I
Back to it.
interrupted.
No, I asked if anybody here has ever read these books. There's one specific one. I know my mom read it and was telling me all about it, and I was like, that is straight up weird. But the more I've read about it and listened to this, symbolism of people supporting each other and helping each other, and we're trees and, all that, it's kind of like, maybe there's something more there than just my mom being my mom, I might need to pull that book up and look into it.
It's always a good idea to go back and reread a book.
Yeah, and to listen to your mom.
And then go back to
And
your
to
mom and
listen
say,
to your
Mom,
mom.
I
yeah.
was wrong.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rose's mom. She is very worried about her daughter. No, but I think like when you look at like the temple, right? He brings all these cedars in from Lebanon, and so in a way, the temple is a forest. It is the trees. It is a garden, and Dr. Osborne talked about it being overlaid with gold. And this beautiful light from a tree of lights that's there. And so the idea, the imagery isn't something that mankind came up with, but this is something that God brought our attention to and said, think about this. What does it mean for the people of Israel to draw back into the garden, to seek the Lord under the trees, and to know that you're in the presence of the cherubim, of the seraphim, that the unseen world isn't as far away as we in our modern Western context like to think. We have these real clear categories. There's real life, and then there's this misty, supernatural, one-day pie in the sky kind of a thing. And the ancient peoples didn't think that way at all. Like to them, a king was an incredibly spiritual office, just as much as a priest was going to be. And Dan, you actually did quite a bit of digging into some of the ancient context there. Why don't you break down for us some of the stories and some of the connection to trees and kings that you came across in your reading?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting that as Dr. Osborne's talking about the tree imagery and how it's tied to the king from a divine source, I realized that that the king, just like the territorial spirit, is actually tied to a land, right? And it's only in that land that they have authority, right? And so when they go and conquer another nation, they may fell the trees, or they'll take some of the trees back to their garden, and they have this mini garden where of all the nations that they're ruling over, the trees are there, and it's a constant reminder that, oh yeah, I'm bigger, and my God is bigger than all these other gods.
Mm-hmm.
But that authority doesn't extend beyond the land. In doing research for Jonah, like I said earlier, I came across the Treaty of Esarhaddon, and this is a Baal treaty of the city of Tyre back in the mid 17th back in the mid 7th century BC. And in it, the king Esarhaddon is about to die, and he's going to give his kingdom over to his two sons, and he's afraid that these vassal kings are going to fight back, and so he creates this treaty with the vassal king in Tyre. And part of the punishment for the kingdom of Tyre breaking the treaty is not that the Assyrian god will punish them, but that the Baals will punish them, the Baals of the land of Tyre. And so this would be Baal Zavon, right? You guys have read that in the Bible about Baal Zavon. Well, Mount Zaphon was near Byblos. It was in the kingdom of Tyre and later Ugarit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that it seems that even the king of Assyria didn't have an understanding that his God had authority outside of their own nation.
Yeah. And so then the idea would be that his relationship with those other gods would be, I don't know, the force behind the treaty. And the Bible then makes this wonderful connection where Jehovah goes wherever he wants, does whatever he wants, wherever he wants. There's tremendous power, it's true, in the occult, in the darkness, in the powers of this world. But it's not the same kind of power as we have with our Lord and our God, that he is a chain breaker. He's the one who brings light into the darkness. And that concept of all these authorities being subjected to him is part of this story. And so it's something that we can just overlook and say, oh, okay, God is great, God is good, let us thank him for our food. Like, what exactly are you saying that God is great? Are you recognizing that that's supposed to be the kind of thing where you stop and you say, every good and perfect thing comes down from the Father of lights, that this food on my plate is something that I'm thankful for, not something that I'm asking God to bless, as in like, well, do you pray over appetizers? Do you not? Like the nacho chips at a Mexican restaurant, like, do you have to pray before you eat that or after that? Like, where does the prayer happen? And what exactly is it we're hoping is going to happen when we're praying? I kind of grew up with the expectation that, like, Lord, make this good. Like, or Lord, don't let this choke me, or something. Like, we were asking God to do something to the food.
Did you live with a lot of fear as a child?
I'm a very fear-filled person.
Oh,
yes,
really?
I am. But the concept of stopping and thanking God is way worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
And even though, like, we make that prayer into like a childish thing, to really stop and say, let's begin our meal by acknowledging the greatness of God. And not just his greatness, not like the Baals, but the goodness of God. This isn't a God that dwells in the underworld like the Baals, and they're pouring blood down into graves and holes trying to feed him. This is the God that rose from the dead. This is the God who died on the cross and rose for our sins. That this is the root that the whole concept of our tree imagery comes from. And I just feel like to pull it out of just an academic lens and to put it into real life is part of what I'm hoping is going to happen by talking about this, that people will be able to understand, yes, there is a beauty in understanding the past. There's a wonder in looking into the ancient world and connecting dots, and it moves beyond just head knowledge into the way we live our lives and the things that we do and we say. And so that concept of really framing our thoughts through Scripture, and not just trying to make Scripture say what we want it to say, but am I bothering to understand what it's talking about? And to get that ancient Near Eastern worldview is a great beginning point. You begin to pick this up piece at a time, and parts of the Bible make more sense. But it isn't just so you can then say, now I know the Bible better than that guy over there. It's to say, I'm listening to what God is saying. It's like joining a conversation that's been ongoing, and you sit down at the table. You don't expect the conversation to restart now that you're there. You have to understand, what are people talking about? How are they talking about it? And then to not say, well, that's how they did it in the Old Testament, but how can I pull this into changing my life today? Not because I feel like what Christians do is they say, okay, that's in the prophets, and no one reads the prophets, so let's get to the Gospels and the good stuff. And they've cut off this immense part of Scripture that's there for the edification, for the uplifting, for the correcting of the Christian. And if we're going to use this gift that God has given to us, this God is speaking to us through the Bible, I think we need to take this seriously. And so, yeah, there is an intellectual side to this, but there's also the real life boots on the ground. Now that I know this truth, how do I communicate that to my children? How do I communicate that in my church? For me, I ask questions like, how do I use this in the pulpit? How do I use this in my discipleship? It's not just identifying, okay, there's a problem because people used to talk this way and now we don't. Are we supposed to reinvent the sermons in our own words, or is there power and strength in understanding and trying to understand what God is talking about? And the fact that sometimes it's over my head makes me glad, because if I walk into a conversation that I already know the answers to everything, I think that's kind of boring. But the idea of the Bible is not like that at all. And so I feel like I've kind of gone on a rabbit trail here. What are some other things that you guys pulled out of listening to Dr. Osborne? What parts seemed important to you, or what thoughts did you come away with?
I was just going to tag on what Dan was saying, because I really like the idea, again, that these kings' gardens represent the expanse of the kingdom that they've either defeated or they would have trees and things from different areas. Anyway, I think he compared it to the Garden of Eden. You know, this idea of anyway. I just thought that was kind of a really cool thing. But they would also have fish and those kinds of things as well, right? I mean, these would be really like a place of life, but that also would represent.
Yeah, because water was such an important part of life. And so when they set up temples, which were kind of like palaces for their gods, they would have sacred trees inside the gardens. And it wasn't uncommon for there to be sacred pools. The Egyptians had some that were so big that they were floating boats around on them. They were very impressive, but they were creating in microcosm a statement about the whole world. And the Israelites were doing the same thing. When we did our episodes on the temple, they were some of our earliest episodes.
Are we supposed to think like there was this connection to the gods? I mean, this is this picture of what I rule, what I've conquered, what I'm leading, my dominion, my power, my...
Yeah, well, and that's what Dan was talking about a minute ago with the idea of an earthly king, even as powerful a king as the fellows that were ruling in Tyre. They recognized that their authority did not go everywhere. There were places where their authority stopped.
Right, yeah.
And when we read about territorial spirits, we kind of see the same thing. The idea that this God has power here. When the Syrians come down and are battling Israel, they say, well, let's make sure we don't fight them up on the mountains because their God is a God of the mountains. We want to fight them down here in the dirt where our gods have power. And that's a category mistake.
Yeah.
That may be true of the hosts of darkness, but our Lord is the God of gods, the
of
Lord
the hills
of lords.
And the valleys.
The hills and the valleys. I like it.
That's right.
And so,
if we look at that, sorry. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead. No, we're all ears.
No, I was just going to say, if you look back at that same story of Assyria, right? The God has proven himself more powerful than the surrounding gods, but his authority doesn't extend beyond his nation. But when we see Yahweh, he's the one that's given authority, and he takes whatever he wants.
Yeah, there's this sense of a king of kings. That the Bible talks about the Ark of the Covenant as being the footstool of God, as though he who sits in the heavens is enthroned upon the cherubim. And even when you went into the temple, you have the two pillars, right, at the front doors of the temple. And they're made in the image of trees, like two trees. As you walked underneath them, you entered into this sacred space. And in that room is a tree of lights. And there would have been the smell of the incense burning and abundant bread on the table and this beautiful curtain behind which was the very presence of God, the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubims engraved or rather embroidered onto the sheets. Everything about this was screaming about something. But when you go into churches today, it seems to be just, I don't know, about being cool. Like, where did that go?
Well,
the idea of like saying something beyond just, hey, we're trendy.
So what do we do when we see a tree? What should the reader do when we see a type of tree mentioned? What do you read on? Should you pause? And then what are some things that we should start thinking about? Like how do we resource? Like if we want to go a little deeper in the text, I always say let's slow down. But when we see a tree, what do we do? Mm-hmm. This is more practical. I mean, and even when we're preaching and we run by a tree, what can we help educate our people or talk to our people about? Like what will be that process of going through that? Like pomegranate, for example, you see it and you see these kinds of things. And even I remember recognizing anytime there's anything around sexual stuff, like the Song of Solomon, you see pomegranate. So you start connecting the dots a little bit, but I was never really educated what that meant to them. And perhaps it's because of all the seeds that are in it. What was it? Or Zacchaeus is found in a sycamore tree. Why did it name the kind of tree? So where do I go when I read this stuff?
Well, what I do typically is I don't believe any of the Bible is there as filler.
I agree.
I think the whole thing is there on purpose and for a purpose. And so if it's going to stop and specifically tell me, for instance, let's use a story in the Old Testament like Saul. He's getting ready to go and to hunt David. And it says that he's sitting underneath a tree and he's holding his spear. This idea of a great tall man sitting underneath a tree with a weapon of death in his hand that really is just a small tree in its own right. Mm-hmm. You get this idea of one tree that is for death and another tree that is there for life, and there's Saul in the middle. And so you have this little sermon that isn't talked about except in the symbolism. It's shown instead of told. And so I think that one of the things that I'm excited about for things like that is that so many Christians believe that they know everything that's in their Bible, or they've engaged with all of the major stuff that's there and they get bored, or they're not sure what they're looking for. And so I think it's important as a pastor and as a podcaster, I guess, to let people know there are things in the text for you to discover, for you to stop and meditate about. And so what I do when I read that story about Saul is I ask myself, first of all, what am I seeing in the text? And it seems to be there's this little picture, a little scene for me to think about. And then what I'm supposed to do is to pull that away and to ask, okay, are there other places in the Bible where this happens? So I observe, I interpret, I apply, and I correlate. The application then is the part where then the rubber meets the road. Are there things in my life that are death, that are pulling me away from the path that God is calling me to do? And so even though it may not be a spear, it calls me to reflect. And it's one of the things that I do every time I take communion. And there the image changes from that of the tree to that of bread and a table that's set before me. But the concept of abundance, of Eden, is still on display. And so before I come and take the bread and drink of the wine, I'm preparing my heart. I'm removing the weeds that are growing in the garden. I want to come into the presence of God refreshed and having purposefully taken these steps. And so I think there are a lot of things, Jacob, that are simply there to stop you, to make you ask why, to make you have a conversation with another human being, and to say, hey, do you think this is random? Do you think this has meaning? And I think the more the pulpits talk about this kind of thing, and we equip people not only to understand what we're reading, but to then understand what to do with it and to say, okay, what's the questions I'm supposed to ask? How does this apply to my mothering or my fathering or my employer? Then it becomes what it seemed to be for the ancients. when they wrote the first Psalm, never mind. The first Psalm is what I'm trying to, Psalm 1, there it is.
Yeah.
That seems to be what he
It
did.
is 5 books, John.
Yeah, it's 5 books. First Psalm, not second Psalm or third Psalm. Thank you. I like this guest. Dan, you can come back anytime. I need you to say more mean things about Rose in future, though, if you don't mind.
Okay, so I'm going to bust in here because that's what Jacob said to do. He's like, just get in there.
Get it.
Yeah. Okay, so it just occurred to me.
It's very rude.
Yeah, well, I have 3 pastors sitting here with me, and we could do some of this in real time. I mean, there's a lot of references to trees in the Bible that I think, what? One of them, actually, my sister brought this one up. Rebecca, her nurse, Deborah, or it says nurse in some translations, died and was buried under an oak tree near Bethel. Why was she buried under an oak tree? Have you ever tried to cut the ground under a tree? It is the pits. Like, we've tried to plant things in our yard, and we have maple trees everywhere, and Jeremy has literally hatcheted the ground sometimes to get these things in. How and why would you plant somebody under an oak tree?
Well, if you think about it, an oak tree or a terebinth tree is very strong. It's big. It's a headstone of headstones. And so to bury someone underneath an oak tree is to say something about the person that you're burying. Firstly, that this person is important enough for us not to just take a convenient path and put them in a cave or let their body, decompose in its natural state in out in an open field. But you're going to a place that's also going to draw people to it in years to come. And so when the family would gather under the oak tree, Grandma was there. She was. This is a weird thought for us because we don't picnic in cemeteries all that often. But the idea of community was very much a part of the way that they were viewing these things, that this is a place that isn't supposed to be left and then visited just when the next person dies. But this is a place for gathering. This is a place of community. And trees do that. They make us come back to this place. And in a world where, water is plentiful and clouds are a normal thing here, living in the ancient world in the desert, a tree would have been a noticeable thing. You want shade. It's dangerous to be out in the sun. And if there's a tree growing there, there's water close by. It's putting her in a garden-like place. It's a way of showing honor to her.
So it says more about the person being buried than anything.
But it also says something about the love that you have
that's
for
what
this
I mean.
person.
Yeah, the person that you're burying. Like, you should maybe look at that and focus on who is being buried and why. Why would this... I think the one translation, like I said, says a nurse. I don't know if it was something more than that, but yeah. And then another one, this is fun. When they were in exile and it said that they hung their harps on the willow trees?
Uh-huh.
Why did they hang them on willow trees?
Well, what does a willow tree make you think of?
Water.
Water?
They like water.
It makes me think of tears.
Oh,
We even call them
good one.
weeping willows. Willow trees are not very powerful trees, but they're trees that are hunched over. Their branches trail in the water.
They're melancholy.
They're melancholy. And so the idea is I have placed my songs in the tree of sorrow, that this is what I'm going through right now. And the mere idea that there is a tree that gives that image shows that they were trying to express their emotions through the physical world around them. I think that's another example of them being in their world, and we just kind of live on it. That they were looking around and saying, okay, this tree means something. It expresses an emotion. In a way, it's art. And to hang your tree, or not to hang your tree, but to hang your harp in the tree, willow branches aren't all that sturdy. You got to really put it in the heart of the tree if you're going to get it to stay anywhere. Dan, have you thought about that image at all? Of why hang the harp in the willow tree? Mm-hmm.
I have not really. Going back to the oak tree, I was just thinking though. I live here in the Mojave Desert, so the climate is actually very similar to Israel. It's the only 2 places in the world that Joshua trees grow. But natural trees, we don't really have a lot of natural trees. It's mostly large bushes, mesquite and acacia, things like that. And so if I'm in the wilderness and I come across an oak tree, that's a major landmark, right? I'm going to use that for navigation. I'm going to know, I'm always going to know where I leave my family members. Outside of a cave, this is a giant landmark in the wilderness.
Mm.
I got another verse. I'm just pulling a few up. This is in Psalm 52. I don't know. I'll just read the verse instead of reading the context. You can go read the context. It says, "But I am
Who
like."
needs context?
I mean, just for the sake of time. I mean, this is to get people in the Bible. That's fine. Psalm 52, verse 8. "But I am like an olive tree flourishing in the house of God. I trust in God's unfailing love forever and ever." I am like an olive tree. What's your thoughts?
Well, what are your thoughts?
I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Well, I mean, this seems like an individual who is giving life, is sharing his stuff, who is providing for others. That there is a fruitful life, and this is just me because you go back a little bit, and this is context. I'm sorry, I'll go back for you. It says, verse 5, "Surely God will bring you down to everlasting ruin. He will snatch you up and pluck you from the tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous will see and fear. They will laugh at you, saying, 'Here now is a man who did not make God his stronghold, but trusted in his great wealth and grew strong by destroying others.'"
So he defined right and wrong for themselves.
But I'm like an olive tree.
Yeah, which isn't a powerful tree.
Flourishing in the house of God.
So the difference between an oak and an olive is immense. When you see an oak tree, you think that's what a tree is supposed to be. It's a great big tree. It's what you'd hang a tire on to go swing. Like it's a powerful plant. An olive tree, they don't get very big. They don't grow real high. They're not 100-foot olive trees out there. They grow about 10, 12 feet, and that's about it. And then they just grow out. And so there's this concept of meekness, of not weakness, but meekness, and of conquering through love and compassion and caring for others. And it's interesting to me that it says that it's like an olive tree. Did it say in the court of the Lord? What did it say?
In the house of the Lord.
In the house of the Lord. When I was up on the Temple Mount, and you guys were there with me, they didn't really have a whole lot of trees up there. It was very stony, and it's easy to think of that. And in most of the pictures and things you see of the Temple Mount, it's very New York City-ish. You know, it's got lots of paved streets, and it's just this very urban setting. That seems to be describing the temple as a place where trees were growing, as a place where there were olives that would then be used to create the oil and things that were used to anoint things. And so the image there, as a difference between what Dan was talking about earlier with the king of Tyre, is that he ruled through power and through the manipulation of other people and other things. And what he's saying in this text is that, hey, you can do that, but pride goes before a fall. The Lord will resist you. And the one who is like an olive tree, that's to remind me of what God is like. When Jesus came, he didn't murder the powerful. He didn't overthrow the government. He stooped to conquer, I think is the phrase that's used. And that idea of loyal love, of humility, that Dr. Osborne pointed out when he talked about the stump of Jesse, that there was this massive tree that was cut down, and the image that Isaiah uses to show us is that there's a shoot that grows up out of the stump, that this stump wasn't dead. It doesn't, like you would expect, if I wrote it, like if it was John Dillon and God was like, all right, write a poem that shows how great Jesus is, the stump would have erupted into like this massive Asgard-like tree, you know, like the world tree. There it is. It's bigger than you ever thought. You had no idea it was there. Instead, what Jesus or the Holy Spirit does through the text is he says, no, it's meek, it's lowly, it's gentle. It's this very small, sweet growth that's there. And it's this thing that changes the world. And I think as a Christian, there's a tremendous moment for me to just stop and ask myself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I trying to control things? Am I trying to make people do what I want them to do? Is this about gathering more power and more of a voice? Or am I simply seeking to be a blessing? Am I taking my place in church and the people around me and acknowledging them as they are trees in their own right. They are part of the garden, and I need to honor what they're doing and help them to grow, and also to add to the beauty of where we are by being the kind of person that God wants me to be. And so it stops being just about myself, and it becomes about this idea of being part of something bigger. And as a pastor, I tell you, man, that is my prayer for my church. It's not just like, I do want to preach a good sermon, okay? Like, I don't want people to go home and be like, I don't know what you were talking about up there. But I know that our church will never be what God wants it to be if it's pulpit driven. It has to be us as a community of believers, the garden of God, the people of God, living and being what God has made us to be. Rose, you look like you're thinking about something.
Yeah, I am. I'm thinking. You keep referencing modern church, like the church today, universal
capitals.
church.
Well, I'm talking really here about the Western church as I experience it.
I know, but and then you are juxtaposing it against walking into the temple and seeing the garden imagery and the beauty and things. What can you do to reconcile those two things today? Because, I mean, it might be said that the trendy edginess of today's churches is just, the new version of the temple being so beautiful. I know that it's not. I'm just saying, no, I don't think it's possible to put ourselves back there because we are the church. We are his creation.
Well, and I think it can also err on the other side. Like my church was originally built by the German Baptists, and they're very plain. And so they were making a statement by not having any sort of bells or whistles in their building. And so I guess the idea was to be untrendy when they built it. But I think to misunderstand the purpose of it. I'm not opposed to there being a stage set up.
Yeah, I know.
If you want to have, all that I'm saying is that there was a time when beauty was an end in and of itself within our community. And I miss that. I read about it and I see it, and I want it to be part of the community that I'm experiencing today. I want the church to see itself not just as a religious thing, but as God's people here on the earth, and to celebrate beauty and love and joy, and to embrace truth and all of those things, not as separate things. Not like do you remember the old lunch trays that had like the dividers in them?
I sure do.
Applesauce didn't touch your green beans and that kind of a thing. To not have that, but to instead recognize this is all part of my faith. That it isn't something that's just true spiritually, but this is life. And I am a spirit. I'm embodied, and one day that will cease to be. But to infuse meaning behind the things that we're doing.
Can I throw a curveball? Am I allowed to do that?
Yeah, because I dodged Rose's question.
I'm so not done. So go ahead, Jake.
No.
I
I want my question to kind of be last because I'm going to throw some stuff in there. I have some questions about some tree stuff, but Rose, go ahead then.
I'll tell you what. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to express this very well, but I'm going to give it
We'll
a shot.
help you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a big and also.
That was sarcastic and rude and
No, I'm
cutting.
for
She's
real.
grateful.
I need some help, guys.
Yeah,
help me
I'm
sort
here.
this out. This is what I've thought about a lot since we were with Dr. Osborne. So if you take the imagery of the temple that you've been talking about, I don't want to say keep talking about because it's not like you're hammering it home or anything, John. And then you talk about the modern church and how we worship today. And then I remember when we were in Israel, we went to, I think it was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and maybe the Church of the Nativity and maybe both. They were heavy with symbolism and iconography and just
Trees and all kinds of stuff.
and candles and saints and the whole thing.
Paintings.
Yeah.
Those were the biggest
Carvings.
candles I'd ever seen in my life.
And so many. So many. And I just keep feeling that people are, through all of it, we're wanting to worship. And we are trying to do it the way that we can, I don't know. I'm not saying there isn't a wrong way, but I don't know that there's always just a right way. You seek the Lord and you call out to him. And if he sends you all kinds of imagery to do it, like he did that with the temple, he did that in the tabernacle, if he's just asking you to quietly kneel in the grass and pray to him, then that's what you do too. I'm not sure there's a right way or a wrong way to do it sometimes.
Yeah, I'm just worried that we've stopped trying, I think is what I'm trying to say. And I had a hard time in some of those places because the culture that was expressing the art was so very foreign to me. But I don't want people to then think there's no room for you to also express your love for God and the beauty that God is to you and working in your life. My favorite place that we were at in Bethlehem, at the Church of the Nativity, was this, not in the church at all, but outside the church, there was this little courtyard filled with orange trees.
Oh, yeah, right.
And underneath that is where St. Jerome was translating the Vulgate. And so it was a really neat place, but it was almost like this little side part of the tour that we were going on. And to me, that place was gorgeous. And it was a picture of the abundance. I've never, maybe our buddies who live in Florida and stuff, but for someone from West Virginia, oranges grow in Kroger's, not in trees. And so seeing them there was beautiful. And I'm worried that the church has grown to the point where we don't engage with the effort anymore. We're saying, well, I'm not allowed to be creative. I'm not interested in these things. Everything worth saying has been said. And so why try? And I feel like the Christianity that my culture was based on was very backwards looking. There was anything new was suspicious. Anything that was not the old time way was suspicious. If it didn't come out of Mayberry, we had a problem with it. And so the idea then of, not to say that everything is okay, but where did the desire to be beauty, to be love and compassion, and to view these things with meaning behind them disappear to in my life? I don't want it to be gone. And so when I spot things like this in the text, it encourages me to come back to this. Dan, what's it like out there? Are you picking up what we're putting down? Are you opposed? What are your thoughts?
No, I don't know if you guys saw Carrie Griffel, our friend, posted on her podcast Facebook page today a question about liturgy.
I did see that.
And yeah, and I think everybody has a liturgy, whether they realize it or not, whether it's formal or not. There's a liturgy to a service, but I think there's something beautiful in a formal liturgy. And I think it's making a comeback because, for the longest time, at least in my tradition, we would observe, growing up, we'd observe the Lord's Supper once a quarter, right? Because if you did it every week, then it wouldn't be special. But I've experienced it otherwise. I think having a formal liturgy leads our congregation into understanding adoration and confession and thanksgiving and supplication and all these things. And the celebrating the Lord's Supper together as a family is a beautiful thing. And it should have meaning for every follower of Christ, no matter how often we do it.
Yeah, and I think there's even a disconnect in, you assume that if you do it all the time, everyone will understand it. And that has not been my experience at all. Like, there has to be teaching. There has to be the passing on of what these things mean to people, or else it just goes over their head, and they're reading Hosea without understanding really what's going on, or they're trying to find Jesus in every paragraph of Leviticus, and they're getting frustrated. There are lots of things that our churches do, but people aren't understanding what's going on. And so I guess what I'm saying is the pulpits need to step up. The men and women who are discipling one another need to engage with a broader context, not of saying, okay, the Bible talks about this stuff, but that's just for nerds. And what we need to do is to focus on that, but to see that this is all part of the same conversation, that this is all part of one thing that's going on.
And part of that is us remembering the macro story, right? That we've been given as followers of Christ. We've been given a biblical mandate, right, to join God in, right? And that extends into the commission of Jesus to go out and to make disciples. We are extending God's garden. We are reclaiming the nations. Yahweh is the Most High God, and He has full authority, and He's given it to Jesus.
Preach, son. I like that.
I know that was mentioned also in that podcast. He had talked about how it's 100 degrees outside and he's sitting in the air conditioning, and being in Iraq and in that heat, it was 130. I think it's the hottest. It was really, really hot.
Wow.
Now, when you're outside, you're just looking for somewhere where I don't care if you're crawling underneath your trailer. You're finding somewhere where there's shade, and so a tree is definitely a place that if you see it, you're going to walk towards it and stand under it. You're not going to rest out in the sun. You just won't.
It draws you to it.
So the picture of us being trees or being like a tree, I mean, I keep thinking the idea of being one that will be a place of comfort, a place of shade, a place of rest, a place of life, a place of food or, nourishment. And for us as believers to be a tree, and it doesn't make much sense to us because we can just go inside. But, being out in that space for them trees, especially when they're going somewhere, finding not only when you see a tree in the distance are you thinking shade, but also you're thinking water. And so there's a space of this idea that I'm moving towards life. So this, for us as Christians, is that the same thing as the world looks in on us? Are we a place of life? Is there something that people want to walk towards us that are in darkness, or walking towards the light? We're walking towards. So us being trees is one that's providing those things that we should, at least, right?
I think so. And I think that's a big part of, I know people like to divide this up into its compartments, but I'm telling you, there are nerds out there and there are regular people out there, and they love ancient stuff. And the Bible is filled with it. There are people out there who are just regular people, and they are fascinated with the supernatural. And the Bible is filled with it. And then there are people out there who are just trying to get through life and to be a decent person. And the Bible has stuff on all of this.
Yeah.
It's a one-stop shop. God has gone over and above what is needed to communicate to people. And for the church to just say, listen, we only want to talk about this in a way that we're comfortable with, or in a way that's popular now, is to misunderstand that it's calling us into a bigger community, that of the past and the present and the future. So going back to that tree that you're talking about, if that was a tree, say that Rose's person that she was talking about before, who was buried there, this then becomes a place where the family gathers.
Right.
And you remember the past.
You could hang out for a long time.
And you enjoy the present. And you know that in the future, I'm probably going to rest under these trees as well. It may be a place where weddings are taking place. It's the kind of thing that became important to your life. And modern people still have this. There are places that are special to me that my family would go to, or there are streams that I love to fish. And so going there is healing for my mind and my soul. And to be there isn't just to be fishing. I may not fish at all, but just to be there is good for me. And there are still things like that. Or you'll smell something and it reminds you of grandma's house, or it pulls you back to childhood. All of this is the way that God made humans to be. And so when you turn the Bible into just a gigantic list of things to do and not do, or a list of facts to be learned, you're misunderstanding that this isn't a dead book. This is a living thing. It is to bring into being things in our lives today, just like it did for the ancients. And so it's important for you to understand what they're saying, to know what they meant by trees and what the symbols meant to them. And it's also important for you to then engage with that in your own life and in your own way. And when we don't do that, we end up in just making up weird things and trying to fill in stuff that we think should be in the Bible and isn't.
Can I ask my random question?
Oh, yes, but Daniel has to answer them because we
All right.
never know the answers.
I'm ready.
All right, Daniel, have you ever seen or we can all say this, but Daniel, Devil's Tower in Wyoming? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
If you haven't, you can Google it. Do you think that was a tree?
I've seen it. Do I think it was a tree?
At one time, yeah. The question is it a petrified tree stump?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to study. It's a little bit big for a tree. I'm out here with the sequoias and the redwoods, and that would be a lot bigger than one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen the sequoias. I've been to General Sherman. It's a little bit overwhelming when you see it, but yeah, the Devil's Tower is definitely a huge. If that was a tree, it had to be huge. Makes me think of Avatar.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge.
No, I've never been out west. I'd love to one day see the stuff that's out there, and to see the sequoia. Well, that does kind of look tree-ish. Boy, Paul Bunyan did a good job chopping that thing down. I'll tell you, if that was a tree,
I know
that was a great big one. Where'd the rest of it go?
I don't know. It was cut down. That was flood time. I don't know.
Maybe.
It's just the questions. A
That
lot of
did
people are
come out
asking
of
that
nowhere.
question.
Let's just
I
make
know.
stuff up. Yeah.
Well, no. It's. I don't know what brought this up. It was about a year ago. I saw this and I was like, And there was there's other trees like not necessarily as big as that, but just like that they're like these look like they have trees, and they actually look on the top of them. Looks like there's there's a ring formation. It's like it looks like they were trees. So
Well, I don't know whether that's a tree or not, but I do know that in ancient myth they talked about trees like that they reached into the heavens and into the underworld, and then in our world they gave fruit, and so this thing divided up the universe, and it was a beautiful symbol, still is. And so I think taking things then like, I don't know, we have a lot of people who argue about should you celebrate Christmas or Easter, or are Easter bunnies appropriate, winter solstice, Halloween, those kind of things.
Repent.
And I just feel like we're missing the point by arguing about a lot of this stuff, and that in our desire, I don't know, I just feel like people are awful cantankerous about things, and they're willing to fight, and they're not always willing to talk or to study and to engage in conversation. And that's one of the things I enjoy, Nan, about this podcast, and having you on here has been a blessing. I just really like talking with people, and we're not fighting, we're just asking questions and reading the text together. And so, my friends, I hope that you go back and you re-listen to Dr. Osborne's lesson, and that you engage with the thoughts of tree imagery in Scripture, and you allow it to address the way that you're living your life. And so, Dan, thanks so much for being on here with us. Final thoughts or anything you want to say you want to give a shout out to your second cousin's wife's dog, former owner, or whatever floats your boat?
No, I appreciate you guys having me on, and I always enjoy a good theological discussion. So thanks.
I really enjoyed having you here, Dan, and I liked the notes and things that you sent me. We didn't get into all of it, but it looked like you were really digging into the text and history, and so it's such a fascinating book. And so for people like you and me who really enjoy the history and getting into the weeds, it's a treasure trove. And for people who are just engaging in the here and the now, it's a treasure trove. And so when we can get all of us together, I think that we become a richer community. We are able to benefit from one another's company. And so I'd like to thank all of our listeners out there. We're going to try to have some of the folks who are engaged in ministry onto the podcast a couple times a year. And so, Dan, you were the first guy that came to mind when we thought about this. And so if you've ever got something that you want to talk about, let us know, brother, and we'll have you back.
I appreciate it.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for meeting with us. Rose and Jeremy, I appreciate you guys too. And Jacob, I appreciate
It's great being
you
back.
as well. But my friends, I hope that God blesses you, and that you are able to really think about this and to spend some time praying and loving on the Lord your God, because he is the God of gods, mighty and awesome.